great panelists here are each going to give you a story about how their business operations have had to change in fundamental ways in order to incorporate sustainability. Just to the right, your right of me is Cindy Coots, and Cindy is the president of Sims Recycling. She started with Noranda when they were running a technology recycling business in 1989 and spent most of her business career involved in electronics recycling business, considered a form of above-ground mining. So, interesting concept of why Noranda got into it in the first place. In 1993, she participated in the Leadership for Environment and Development program, looking at sustainable development issues on a global basis. She's been involved with waste recycling issues from a commercial perspective and from a regulatory policy perspective at both the international level, UN and OECD, and the domestic level. Most recently, she's been involved with Sims Recycling Solutions, the world leader in electronics recycling, and has developed Canada's most advanced end-of-life electronics recycling technology. Next to Cindy, we've got Toby Lennox, and Toby is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Communications for the GTAA, the epicenter of this Partners in Project Green. Toby joined the GTAA in 1995, and he's now Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Communications. Prior to joining the GTA, Toby practiced corporate law with Osler, Hoskin & Harcourt in Toronto. And then beside Toby, we have Ian Forsyth, who's the Director of Corporate Planning and Business Strategy with Nissan Canada, also in the zone. Ian has spent most of his life in the automotive industry at Nissan. He's responsible for long-term business planning activity at Nissan and aligning the company's long-term goals with the year-to-year business plans. In addition, as part of his responsibilities, he's the leader of the Nissan Leaf team. Very exciting launch going on this year at Nissan Canada. And he's excited that all the hard work on Leaf has culminated in bringing the vehicle to the Canadian market this year. So we'll hear more about the Leaf EV in a moment. And then at the far end there is Brad Ryder, by nights hockey player, but by days the Director of Public Affairs and Communications at Coca-Cola. He's a public affairs professional with several years of experience in a variety of roles in not only Coca-Cola, but also pharmaceutical, resource, and consumer goods sectors. He's got extensive international experience in Europe, Africa, and North America in both the corporate and non-profit organizations. So he'll be bringing a consumer packaged goods perspective to this dialogue. So I'm going to lead a bit of a dialogue one-on-one with the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions. So listen along and then give us your toughest questions. And they clearly think that I'm a little. I've always known that I'm short, but this is ridiculous. So let me flip to the right page here. So one of Cindy's challenges is to get consumers to think about long-term impacts of their purchases. So her computers or her inputs live on for generations. And so one of the trade-offs she has to make in her business, but also she has to get consumers to make, is that trade-off between investing for the long term versus short-term gains. So Cindy, how do you get consumers to think about the long-term benefits of using recycling, or whether it's recycling or other decisions, as opposed to the immediate short-term advantage that they might see?
Well, it's a great question, and in the introduction you mentioned that I started with Noranda in 1989. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. And that was the first year within an international mining company that individuals had computers on their desks. I mean, this was really new. We still had people typing contracts on typewriters with carbon paper and all kinds of things, so I'm dating myself. But you think about 1989 to now, it's a relatively short time period, and we've got all kinds of new technology. In fact, yesterday most of us who have Blackberries couldn't do business because technology was down. You know, cameras weren't working, and consumers don't often think of what happens to those devices when they die. You throw them in your desk drawer or your garage or your attic, and you go out and buy a new one, either because it's cool or it's got new features or your old one died. And we've always thought about what happens to those products when they do die, and they're full of resources. In fact, they contain the entire periodic table of elements. So that's really good stuff like metals, copper, steel, aluminum, that we have to mine. We have to go build new mines that has a big carbon footprint. And if you can produce a pound of copper, for example, from a recycled product, you save 80% energy versus mining a new pound of copper. Plastics, they're made from petrochemicals. You want to recycle those. And then there's all kinds of nasties in there, like mercury and lead and arsenic and cadmium. So it's a big education process to get people to understand that they're little gadgets, and they're getting smaller, but they're getting more technical and consume more resources to provide you with functionality, need to be recycled at the end of their life. So what do? You can throw it in a landfill. It's easy, it's cheap, it's not illegal, and you lose all those resources and you potentially pollute because there's hazards in there. Or maybe you do some research and you look up on the internet potential recyclers. And you find some and you call them up and one guy says, yeah, I'll recycle your stuff, send it to me, I'll pay you for it. And then you call Sims, and Sims says, we've invested millions of dollars into technology and we can give you the highest recycling rate. We'll recover every ounce of material, every gram of material in there. We do it without harming the environment. We use green energy. We protect our staff. We don't export it to developing countries, but it's going to cost you something. So you're the decision maker. Short term versus long term. I can landfill it. I can send it to a cheap recycler that may send it over to Asia where they'll pick out the good bits and pieces but throw the pollutants into the rivers and lakes, and it happens. I go twice a year to see it. Or I can pay a little bit more today and know I'm doing the right thing. So it's this constant education battle to get people to understand what the right solutions are. And it's not easy because we all are under economic pressure. We all have 1,000 things to think of, and this is just one element of our daily life. As businesses, we have the same decisions to make. Maybe it's the IT manager, maybe it's the VP sustainability. Who knows who the decision maker is? They have to weigh something that's not necessarily core to their business, how to dispose of my end-of-life electronics with economic considerations. So it's all about education. Unfortunately, with something like electronics that are very diverse materials, it sometimes takes regulations. So those of you who live in Ontario, if you go and buy a new piece of electronics today, if you look at the bottom of your bill, you'll see an EHF on there, an environmental handling fee. It's not an eco-tax like it was portrayed in the press. It's a fee that covers the proper recycling of that product at the end of its life. So it's about influencing behaviors of people, providing education so that they can make sound decisions that may be good for 10 years from now and not necessarily tomorrow.
So just to follow up on that, because it actually is a good segue to Toby, internally, you have to make, as I understand it, you build extremely expensive facilities to separate the waste, and you're projecting out how society will be handling waste in 10 years' time. How do you make those internal decisions and know whether you're allocating capital in the right way, given that you're projecting how society is going to behave, and you're personally taking a long-term view of things? And how do you answer to shareholders that your capital is being appropriately deployed?
Good questions, and if I had a crystal ball, it would make it easier. But a couple of things. First of all, technology dies, and although the life cycle today is getting shorter, we're still seeing televisions coming in for recycling that are 10, 20 years old. So we know some of the technology will take a while to come back through the system, and we can predict what's required for recycling of those products. But the rate of change is so fast now that we need to be tapping into the manufacturers of products. And typically, the large original equipment manufacturers, the Hewlett-Packards of the world, the Lexmarks of the world, have different divisions that are responsible for managing end-of-life products and design. So we would deal with the end-of-life management people, and there was no feedback into the design folks. And we really want to know the design folks so that they can design more benign materials or more easily recyclable materials into electronics. And it's starting to happen. A lot of organizations are now looking at sustainability more seriously, and they want to incorporate more recycled raw materials into the production of a new product. So we're starting to get that dialogue going that helps us understand what are the materials that will be designed into products for use in the next 5 years. But it's not easy.
Okay. keep feeling like I'm a director. And so Toby, at the GTAA, particularly with your new build, you are looking at a couple decades. How do you take sustainability into account when you're doing incredible long-term planning for building these enormous pieces of infrastructure?
Yeah, well, I think that's a particular challenge that something like an airport has, because just to give you the sense of scale of what we deal with, so we deal with about 33 million passengers a year. We are by far the largest airport in Canada. And the likelihood is that there's not going to be another airport around. So we're the ones that have to accommodate the demand for traffic, and for a growing demand for traffic, because the population of the Toronto area is so diverse and changing so much. So we are always constantly planning about 30 years out. And what we have been forced to do is, it's not simply good enough to look out 30 years and say, well, the traffic projections are going to be this, so we have to build whatever. What we started to be challenged by was the reality that the world that we're going to be building into and operating into is going to be a fundamentally different place. And while there may be things that we know that, our fuel prices will probably be higher, we may be talking about some kind of carbon regulation, but you're not going to be able to get to Vancouver and you're not going to get to Paris by train. So there will still be a place for aviation, but the question is, how do you build facilities that are going to accommodate aviation and do so in a sustainable way? So part of what has started to happen, and it really goes to, I think, your theme is sustainability from the inside out. It goes very much to the people that you've got, and you've got the empowerment that you are giving to the teams of people that you're working with, to challenge them to say, okay, don't just look at the traffic projections. Try to tell me what the world is going to be that you're going to have to operate in, and we're going to have to operate in the next few years. What do we need to do to be truly sustainable, not simply as a business, but also as a piece of infrastructure? And as a result, we've done some things like scenario planning. So we've done, okay, what does the world look like in a number of years? There was a really interesting piece of work done about what are the impacts of climate change to be on our airport. So what happens when your 100-year storms start coming every, 10, 15 years? And as a result, that makes us look at our facility in a very different way. But then the challenge is, okay, how do I get there? How do I go from what the facility that I've got right now, and we're doing quite remarkable things to reduce the energy consumption right now, changing airfield lighting. I mean, if you walk into our terminal building during the day, most of the lights are off. Really interesting things being done with heating and cooling, but we're probably looking at most of the low-hanging fruit. It's challenging the teams to start figuring out projects that we can do that then can be incorporated into the next phase of building. Because the way that we look at traffic projections, we're going to have to build another pier. And so the pier are those large fingers that go off that central processor. Those cost about $700–800 million a piece. They're huge. The distance is they're about a kilometer long. But the targets that we've set are that building is going to have to be carbon neutral. So how do we do that? So what we're going to start seeing at the airport are basically trial runs. You won't see them as passengers, but are we talking about solar panels? We're going to be doing a geothermal project on one of our fire halls to see what that's going to yield for us. But we don't right now have the solutions. But we're also recognizing that it's okay. It's okay not to have them. But it's also okay to be challenging our teams to be saying, think in a world that is a few years from now. Think, what does that look like? What do we have to do to get there? Don't be afraid to fail on projects. There are going to be things that we're going to do that aren't going to work. Turn back. The number of people that phone us to put solar panels on our roofs. I mean, like, stop, don't call us. Thank you very much. But also, it's interesting. Someone said, we were saying, well, why don't we do an offset program? That'd be a good sustainable thing to do. And some of the teams said, well, why are we paying somebody else? Why don't we just start paying ourselves? And so we have an internal carbon offset program, which allows us to create a fund for sustainability projects that we have access to and we build into our capital planning. So the very fact that we have to plan for such staggeringly long periods creates challenges now, but it goes back to getting the right people and equipping them with the right challenges and empowering them to start coming up with a whole series of ideas that we can do that will manifest themselves when we build that pier in 7-8 years, when we build another pier, when we have to start redesigning our airfield to start dealing with things like floods. Because, eventually with the 100-year storms, are we going to start seeing some of our runways going to get flooded? So it's that kind of exercise that we're engaged in right now. Don't say we've got all the answers, but it's certainly been really quite gratifying to see the response that we're getting. So.
Interesting. One of the changes that could well happen in the next 30 years is the electrification of transportation. Are you taking that into account as you think about the future of the GTAA?
Well, it's interesting that I'm sitting next to, we were going to have leaf races because we have people from Toronto Pearson here that brought our leaf, so we're going to do leaf races in the parking lot. The challenge there is that we already have one of the largest electric vehicle fleets in the country because it's within the terminal, you wouldn't see it. But there's 65,000 vehicle trips, for example, to Pearson Airport every day. Only 2% of those trips are done by any form of public transit. So before I start talking about electrification of vehicles, we need forms of public transit that can start moving that number of people. There's 38,000 people that work at the airport. They're all driving their cars. So it's about cars first. It's then a question of, yeah, it is, but your aircraft still have to get off the ground using some form of fuel right now. And we really don't see that being replaced by anything. So yeah, it is about electrification of vehicles, but it's also about just different forms, looking at transport very different.
Interesting. Okay, well, perfect segue to Ian. So Ian, you've had a long career in the car business. What changes when you start introducing sustainability and in particular electric vehicles into how you run your business?
Well, typically the car companies are kind of the enemy when it comes to sustainability, and we're the poster people for what's wrong with the environmental challenges and taking on the environment. We, of course, feel very put upon by that because we've done a lot of work in terms of reducing emissions from our vehicles, and cars are only a portion of the CO2 emissions that occur in the world. So that's when we take the step of going to build an electric vehicle where there is no CO2 emissions at the point of mobility, that's a real change in our thinking, and it's a real different kind of vehicle that we're going to build. So a couple of things had to happen. One was we had to remember we were still building a car. We're not building a golf cart. We're not building some kind of modified vehicle that only does part of what a car can do. So number one, we had to be sure that with the designers and our engineers that they remembered and understood that they were building a car. And we did. If you drive a Leaf, and I know Toby has, if you drive a Leaf, it is the same as any other car you've ever driven. There's nothing weird about it, nothing odd about it in the sense of the way it operates, other than we have to give people instructions and training, but it really isn't. It just drives like a normal car, and that was extremely important to us, the whole idea of it being a real car. So the one thing was we had to make sure that our engineers and designers understood that. Secondly, we had to understand how to bring the car to market. Our business is very competitive, obviously. We don't typically depend on other people to bring our vehicles into the marketplace, but we soon realized that while electricity is everywhere, it's not accessible necessarily. So partnerships with utilities, with municipal governments, with provincial governments, with NGOs of different kinds, suddenly became part of our business. And it's not exactly something we're comfortable with nor used to doing. So that was, well, we're still learning actually how to work with partners. And I will admit that in the car business, even though we look at fairly long cycles, not as long as Toby does, but we look at 4 and 5 year cycles, which seems like a long time, some of our partners don't seem to see quite the same speed that we do, that we need to do things and get them done now. So that's been an interesting experience for us in learning how to deal with utilities, for example, that have very long horizons, but as somebody once said, they can't see the trees. So, they can see the forest, but they can't see the trees. So that's something that we've had to learn how to do, because we can't just run roughshod over these people. We need them. If electric vehicles are going to be successful, you need those partnerships, and they need to be successful. The third part of it was our own staff. In bringing this vehicle to market, we really had to work with our own employees, not so much to get them enthusiastic, because the people realized that this was something really different, but in educating them and getting them to understand how to talk to customers about an electric vehicle. In the car business, there tends to be a kind of one-way conversation. We'll tell you what you should drive because we know what's best for you. And that's sort of the way we work. We've been selling cars for a long time. People have been buying cars for a long time. They already understand what they want, and so we're just trying to fill in the holes and make it, boy, this is the car you need. In this case, there's a whole lot of communication coming the other way. People are really interested in electric vehicles. They have a whole lot of questions about electric vehicles, and they're things that we don't typically deal with. I mean, finding charging stations, which is working with our partners. Well, gas stations are everywhere, so we don't really give you a list of where gas stations are. It's not an issue, but it is with an electric vehicle. How will it work in the cold? How do I plug it in? What about maintenance? How will it drive? What about top speed? The questions are endless, and they're all interesting because they show us both the passion people have for the electric vehicle, but also the need for education. So having the people that worked on my team understand that and react to it has been really an interesting process, one that's really enjoyable because you really do interact with people. And I do get some strange questions. I can tell you I have been asked more than once, well, why don't you just put a turbine on top of the car, and as it drives along, it'll generate electricity, and then you won't have to plug it in. And I look at people and I kind of go, I'm not sure quite what to say because I don't want to make them feel like they didn't take physics. And I said, well, that's kind of a perpetual motion machine. I don't think we could really do that. Oh, okay. Well, what about an extra battery? And I go, well, the whole idea here is that, weight and so forth. So you get a lot of interesting dialogue. But I think that has really been something unique in terms of this dialogue with people and getting our staff who are working on this project to really get involved. And so we're on Facebook, we're on we're tweeting, and all this kind of things that it's a real two-way street, not just a one-way, okay, here's what you should know about the car. So it really has changed the way we think about how to deal with with selling cars and also with communicating with potential customers.
Is that dialogue having incremental benefits, so it's spilling out into other parts of the company where you can see, hey, dialogue would help us in other aspects?
Well, yeah, because I think, car companies always like to say they listen, and we do in a way, but we also have our own ideas about what you want. But this really is a two-way street because, as I say, we can't sell an electric vehicle unless you have a way to plug it in. If you don't have a way to plug it in, then the car's never going to work for you, obviously. So that has really changed the way we think about communicating and providing information to the customer, and it's given us probably a more sympathetic understanding of what customers need in terms of information.
Great. So one question I have to ask. You say you do 4 to 5 year planning. If you look 10 years out or 15 years out, what's the penetration of electric vehicles? Any guess?
The big question. Well, we will. I'll answer it in a different way. We will have the capacity in our alliance with Renault. We will have the capacity to build 500,000 electric vehicles by 2014. The world demand for cars is around 70 million vehicles. So that's a very small portion of it. GM and Ford and other manufacturers are coming along with electric vehicles. So it could be anywhere from a few percentage points to maybe as much as 20 or 25% of the market. Most people could use an electric vehicle. I know, again, when we talk with consumers, it's, well, you know, I can't get to my cottage. Okay, fine, understand that, but how far do you drive in a day normally? Normally people drive, 90% of people drive less than 90 kilometers a day. So most people could use an electric vehicle. As the range will increase with the batteries and as the type of vehicles expand, personally, I think it could go as high as 40% of the market in 25 years. And the other part of that is, which talks to both, you know, we're talking about your long-term. If we don't bring electric vehicles into the market, we cannot meet our CO2 emission requirements. We simply can't do it. So electric vehicles are essential if we're going to meet our long-term CO2 emission guidelines.
Interesting. Brad, when I think of Coke, I think of liquid and then bottles or cans or some sort of packaging.
That's
right. Obviously, both raise sustainability issues. How does the commitment to sustainability change how you think about both of those sides of your business?
Well, I think, Tom, you've identified really what are not only two pillars of our sustainability strategy, but also two pillars of our business. Without water and without packaging, we don't really have a business. So it's interesting that we've identified these areas that are really so core to our daily functioning. On the issue of packaging and recycling, we really start at home in our plants. We have just up the road in Brampton, the largest Coca-Cola bottling plant facility in North America. And it's a facility that a few years ago we implemented a Target 100 program to capture all of the waste that went into it, all of the plastics and paper. It's now a zero waste facility that's not producing any waste to landfill. So that's what we've done in our plant operations. Obviously, when that extends to our packaging, it becomes more difficult because we don't really always control what consumers do with our products. But we work hard in all the provinces where we operate to work with the various existing extended producer responsibility organizations, the Blue Box system in Ontario and other systems in other provinces to drive the recovery rates of containers as high as possible. And in most provinces across Canada, you're looking at rates anywhere between 65 to 90% recovery. Further to that, something we just launched this year, which is quite innovative, is to actually look at a change to the packaging type itself. A lot of our products, including Dasani water, is packaged in a clear PET bottle that was made from petroleum, essentially. And this year we launched what's called Plant Bottle, where we replaced that petroleum basis, that resin, with a plant-based resin, so that now the Dasani bottles that you buy come manufactured. 30% of the plastic that goes into that bottle comes from a plant resin instead of a petroleum resin. So we're replacing a non-renewable resource with a renewable resource, something that comes from growing sugarcane. It's only 30% because it has to be clear for that particular product. One of our other products people may not be familiar with is a smoothie product called Odwalla. It's sort of a mixed juice product. You sometimes see that in specialty stores, and it's sold in a cloudy bottle or not a clear bottle. And in that particular product line, the plant bottle content is 100%. So we've replaced 100% of the PET with the new plant bottle. So that's what we're doing on the packaging front. When it comes to water, again, you know, it's a core part of our business. The majority of what goes into our products is water. So the first thing we have to look at Coca-Cola is ourselves, our operations. How can we use less water in our process? And we've set fairly ambitious targets of reducing our water use ratio by 20% by 2012 across the board. That's based on 2006 baseline numbers, so it's a pretty aggressive target. And the way that we've done that is looking at our bottling operations where we may have used to use water to wash empty bottles that were to be filled. We've now using pressurized air to rinse the bottles. Where we may have used water on a conveyor belt to help the bottles slide around a conveyor system, we've now developed a dry loop technology that allows the bottles to slide along on that conveyor belt. But of course, at the end of the day, we're still consuming a great deal of water as a company. So we've set the target to essentially capture in the watersheds where we work the equivalent of the water that we use. So the way that we've done this is a team of our global experts out of our head office in Atlanta have set upon doing an assessment of the watersheds around the world wherever there's a Coca-Cola bottling facility, and pretty much everywhere in the world there's a Coca-Cola bottling facility. So what they've really done is something that's not really been done before by governments or other agencies, really to look at the vulnerability and the stress levels that those watersheds are under, identifying areas where there's particular vulnerabilities. In Canada, I mentioned we've got a major bottling plant in Brampton, fairly good watershed. Another one of our plants is in Calgary. That's a watershed that's a bit more under stress. In the United States, there's bottling plants that are in Texas, and as many people know, been severe droughts in Texas the last few years. So we've really identified the watersheds that are under stress. And what we're doing is partnering with major organizations such as the WWF, Sierra Club, looking at ways in which we can develop projects to protect the watershed, to allow for less soil erosion, preserve those watersheds so that more of the water is returned to the natural state, and to try to offset the amount of water that we're using in our process. So it's kind of it's a new initiative for Coca-Cola. It's a new direction for us, and you'll be hearing a lot more of it in the years to come. But obviously, with water being so important to our business, it was really impossible for us to ignore that issue. And quite frankly, it's a very critical issue when we talk about the environment or sustainability globally.
What drove these issues at Coke? Was it a CEO somewhere saying that we want to do this? Was it bottom up? Like, how did it actually transform the company? I
think probably a little bit of both. I mean, obviously our executives, our CEOs are visionary and wise people, and they look at the future, and like with the other organizations we've heard from, we engage in long-term planning. We also have a Vision 2020 planning, looking to the future, identifying the threats, the vulnerabilities. What's the world going to look like 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road? How can we prepare our business to deal with that? And again, being a consumer goods company, we listen to our consumers. We listen to what our consumers are saying, and that's a core part of what our business is all about. Nothing can change your business quicker than a consumer boycott, and we've seen the power of social media. Facebook, our CEO Muhtar Kent is famous for saying, Facebook took down Hosni Mubarak in however many days it took to take down the leader of Egypt. Imagine how many days it would take for Facebook to take down Coca-Cola if our consumers were ever concerned with something we were doing. So I think that both bottom up, really focusing on what your consumers are thinking and feeling, and the way that they're going in the future, and then also from the top up, hiring the best experts, partnering with organizations like the Sierra Club and WWF. We have major partnerships with both of them, understanding the way they see things happening and trying to draw upon that expertise. Also, I mentioned those organizations, but on a very local level, one thing we've just done recently with Toronto Region Conservation Authority is develop a partnership whereby our Coca-Cola syrup concentrate barrels are recycled and turned into rainwater barrels. It just so happens they come in sort of large 55-gallon drum plastic barrels that are great for delivering concentrate to our bottling plants, but they also double really well when they're done as a very handy rain barrel that you can adapt and fix to your eaves trough and use for watering your garden. So we've developed partnerships with Eco-Caledon, with Toronto Region Conservation Authority, donating these barrels so that they can be then used with the local communities and contribute to our goal of achieving that water neutrality that I spoke of.
Great. So one theme that's come up a few times is the importance of looking 20, 30 years down the road. Toby's doing it, building piers. Cindy's doing it in terms of what's the next generation of electronics going to be looking like. To what extent, in our business, the government dramatically affects what the future looks like. To what extent do you, all four of you, work with government in order to set the rules and regulations that will govern sustainability and your behaviors going forward?
Well, in aviation, the one thing that is very odd is that an aircraft leaving our airport will fly into jurisdictions that may be subject to different environmental regulation. So one Air Canada aircraft that goes London Heathrow, Toronto will be subject to a certain environmental regulation. If that aircraft then flies into LAX, it may get subject to yet another one. It's quite possible that the carbon footprint of the airport may be relevant for determining the environmental impact as it's measured in LA, but not in London. Right now in Canada, environmental regulation of aviation is a bit haphazard. And so we're sort of having to anticipate both what's happening in the international sphere, but also what's happening locally and what we're anticipating might happen in the next 20 to 30 years. So it's a bit of an odd situation to be in. But I don't think we have much choice. Do we envisage a world in 10 years, and 5 to 10 years out, which is like ours now? Is it going to be the same in 25 years? We're having a hard time saying, yeah, sure, why not? So anticipating we're sort of in this odd position of having to anticipate what a government might do, but then having to also balance out where international regulation is going. So for us, it's a real mixed bag.
Interesting. Anybody else in terms of how you try to influence?
Yeah, actually, for us it's kind of interesting because the car business has a lot of regulations, and fuel economy, fuel efficiency regs are part of what we deal with. And right now they're set out to 2016, and in the United States they're out to 2025, I think it is. So one of our issues is consistency, and a little bit what Toby's talking about, that we don't want a different set of rules in Canada from the United States because it's very difficult and expensive for us to try to deal with how we then do something in Canada that might be different than in the United States. So our business is quite good at working with governments to try to get that kind of consistency and also to have a long-term view. 10 years out is great for us because that's really 2 product cycles, so that gives us lots of time to figure out what we need to do and to develop our product plans and our marketing plans and so forth around that. However, with the electric vehicle, we find ourselves on the other side of the equation. We want regulation and standards about plug-ins, about EVSEs, the equipment that you use in your home in order to connect to the grid. And we're finding the government very slow to react to this. And we also, which is interesting for us, we find the standards groups very slow to react as well. We want it now, we want it decided now, we want to know what it is now. We don't want to wait 2 or 3 years. Like a building code takes about 3 years to recycle itself, and it takes about, like the next building code doesn't go into place until 2012. Well, to us, no, but we're selling electric vehicles today. So we find ourselves in a very strange position, pushing the government, pushing the CSA and some of the others, the ESA and so forth, groups we never had to deal with, which is part of our process of all these partners that we're going to need to work with, but getting them to give us regulations so we know what we're doing is legal, but also having them understand we're dealing with consumers. This isn't an industry that we're trying to, get a standard for. This is a consumer, and we've warned them a little bit that consumers will do what they want if they want an electric vehicle, so they better be prepared to deal with that. This isn't just at some point we'll do that, and we won't really worry about how complicated it is. Our view is putting in an EVSE in your home should be as simple as getting your cable installed or something like that. A very simple, straightforward process. You're not into lengthy. Well, it should be as simple as putting in an air conditioning unit, actually. When we keep using that as an example, because if I put in an air conditioner in my house, I don't have to phone my local building inspector to come and check it out. I don't have to get a permit. My electrician simply does that. It's installed and I'm ready to roll. So we have this kind of interesting thing going on with us right now and trying to get some regulations that we want in place done quickly enough to actually support the business.
I can add a few things from our perspective as well. It's interesting because we need public-private partnerships, and we have to look after the common good. And as individuals, we're not good at it, or we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today in the world. But it's interesting because oftentimes industry is ahead of regulatory agencies, whether it's standards development, which is really important. So in the recycling industry, when you get recyclers developing new and better technologies fairly rapidly, you want standards in place that pushes all recyclers continuously up that level, so that you have a level playing field among recyclers, but also better environmental and social outcomes. And we find that a lot of times the dialogue with the regulators is really slow and quite painful, because the concern is if the bar is raised too quickly, you don't have enough players in the industry that will be able to participate. But our view is, let's work with governments to set the policies. And if you set the policies right, then you let the free market take over and compete. But if the standards are there and the rules are there, then let industry go and compete on how best to meet those policy targets.
Interesting. So I think now we can open it up to the floor, and we've got about 20 minutes for questions if people want to fire away. Just stand up, and there we are. And you may have to yell a bit so everybody can hear you.
This is for you, Brad. You talked about water being one of your big issues. In the late 80s, some of the VPs of Coke talked about changing the configuration of how they delivered Coke. And it was to put basically carbonation units in fridges so that you would not be transporting the Coke bottles across the world, but you'd only be selling the syrup to the consumer. Has there been any thought about that in terms of reducing your carbon footprint?
Well, we to a certain extent we kind of do that when we have our fountain business, where you would go and where you get a fountain drink rather than getting a bottle drink, and in that case we sell the what we call the bag and box product to those vendors. And if you go to, I don't know, a Subway or a McDonald's or something like that, they'll often use that delivery system. We've also developed, coca-cola developed a sort of freestyle machine, which is a new machine that has actually 80 different kinds of flavors, and you can mix and match, and it's a super high-tech machine. It's just starting to be rolled out now in some restaurants in the United States and Canada as well. We have one in our office, and it's pretty impressive. I think to a certain extent that that market could expand, but I think there's different business models. Some customers prefer it in can, but buying it already in a can and a bottle, and others would buy it in a fountain. It's not suitable for all customers, I think is kind of the short answer. It's okay if you go to a cinema or a restaurant where they have the water and they can mix up the flavors, but maybe not so suitable I don't know, in an office environment or something like that.
Could you comment on the issues of the battery switch out versus the charging issues? Because clearly there's the better place option, and I think your company was involved in that. And also there are jurisdictional issues. I'm a former hydro guy, as you might know, because I think we live right near the hydro line. And so what Ontario would need the LEAF for, as it has surplus nukes, would be significantly different than the other jurisdictions where you sell your car. So what's the issue about charging those cars, whether it's at 15-minute supercharge or pop out the batteries, if the consumer wants that convenience?
Yeah, well, the question is related really to the Better Place model. Better Place is a company that has come up with this business model where you swap the battery in the vehicle, and basically instead of recharging it. In order to do that, somebody needs to come up with the money to build those stations. We're not in the business of selling electricity or of selling batteries per se, so that's their business model. They have put that in place in Denmark and Israel, and Renault has partnered with them or become part of their business model in those two countries. It requires someone to come along and say they're willing to invest that money, which we're not. That's not our business. So if someone does, we're quite interested in talking and seeing, whether it makes sense. It has been used for some experiments with taxis. In Tokyo, they did an experiment where they had swappable batteries for taxis. Actually, it worked quite well, but I don't know whether it was economic. I can only say from a technical point of view, it worked very well, but I don't know whether it was economic in terms of the investment. It is a huge investment because you got to carry batteries, you got to store them. They're not fragile, but they're not something you can just leave lying around. So there's quite an investment in building those battery recycling locations. And then the question is, in a country like Canada, where do you put them? You know, Israel's a very small country. Obviously, distances are very short. The population is really concentrated, so it may make sense. And in Denmark, similarly, but here, you know, population is more spread out, even though we're urbanized, but it's still more spread out. So that's something we'll see if it evolves. So if it comes along and someone's willing to invest, then we're willing to talk to them. The second question was really about I think charging. Well, yeah, and get where the effect. Yeah,
that's great for your.
Well, actually, Canada is almost a perfect country for electric vehicles. Alberta and Nova Scotia, New Brunswick are a little bit high in CO2 production for electricity, but even still, there's a benefit. But if you take BC, Manitoba, Quebec, the CO2 production from electricity is very, very small, and Ontario is really quite good. I'll give you a number. It may not make a lot of sense to you, but in Quebec, 1 kilowatt hour of electricity generates 2 grams of CO2. That is almost nothing. So if you were to drive a Leaf in Quebec for all of your driving, you basically would cut your, an Altima, typically driving an Altima for a year, which is a pretty fuel-efficient vehicle, has roughly the same interior space as a Leaf, you'd generate about 3,500 kilograms of CO2. It's just math. It's an ICE engine and so forth. If you drove a Leaf for that same distance in Quebec, you'd generate about 15 kilograms of CO2. So it's a huge impact. Now, and BC is a little bit higher, and Manitoba is about the same as BC, around 18 or 20 grams per kilowatt hour. Ontario is about 200. So even in Ontario, there's a huge benefit. So there's a benefit in there. There's also a benefit in general terms, even where you're using coal or higher CO2 production, like Alberta or Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, because it's still much lower CO2 than you would get from a similar sized car. So there's a benefit from there. And one of the other benefits is not really it's sort of an environmental benefit, but it's an interesting one. If you're using electricity, it's locally produced. The money and the jobs are in Canada. Even though we are a net exporter of oil, Quebec, for example, imports almost all its oil. It comes from Algeria and from the North Sea. So while Canada as a whole is a net exporter, it's not true on a local level. So if you can reduce your dependence on foreign oil, you've made a huge change in your economics, in environmental impact of moving that oil and so forth. So there's lots of other benefits that go beyond just kind of the math of the generation of electricity. And basically, Canada has enough electricity to support a very, very high penetration of EVs. Something in the neighborhood of 15 or 20% would be required before it would even have some impact, and even then it's quite small. So Canada, from many points of view, is a perfect country for electric vehicles.
Good.
Cindy, I was just wondering, you mentioned that there are a lot of other companies that are doing electronics recycling, or just more or less taking things to places, to areas where not so great things happen. Just wondering, like, to what degree are you guys involved in any kind of name and shame? Because I mean, it makes sense for you guys to from a business point of view, but also I think this is an issue that people are legitimately quite interested in. If they were to find out that companies are doing these sort of things, then you bring visibility on a community level or on a public level. They make us think about it. Politicians listen. They make us think about it, and then things happen. So I guess I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, that's always a tough question, and the way we approach it is to kind of flip it and say what we're going to do is focus on developing really high recycling standards and promoting those, and promoting the compliance to those. So if we can get better recycling standards and have auditing agencies that are either governmental or third party and are well trained at going out and finding those organizations that are perhaps doing illegal things, then that's the best way to tackle it. So nobody likes to stand up and talk about their competition negatively. It's more about putting the systems in place that will ultimately get us to where we want to go. And we think that developing really high recycling standards and targets is the way to get there. So we put a lot of effort into working with, in Canada, the provinces, because waste and recycling is a provincial jurisdiction. In all of the countries, we operate in 40 countries around the world. And next week I'm off to meetings at the United Nations to talk about electronics recycling on a global basis. It's just tremendously slow globally. It's a little bit faster on a provincial basis. But let's flip it around and get rewards for the right behaviors and let those that aren't doing the right thing just be eliminated through attrition.
Question over here.
Oh, sorry. Here you go.
Thanks, Tom. Actually, this is a two-part question. One is, the first part is for Cindy, and it's about the recyclers. It's actually a good follow-on to what you were just speaking about. I really believe in positive incentives. So I wonder if there's been any work done to try to establish some kind of tax credits for companies who want to elevate themselves to certain standards and be able to implement that from a capital perspective, if there's any work going on to establish tax credits.
There really isn't, and interestingly enough, we made a $16 million investment here in Mississauga last year, and with all of the options and all of the policy positions in Ontario to support green technologies and sustainable green businesses and green jobs, there were a lot of tax credits and grants available, but very difficult to get for recycling companies. One of the examples that does exist in Ontario, there is a recycling standard. It's not particularly well managed yet. It'll get there. It's a process. But you get a higher economic incentive if you have a higher recycling rate. So if you recycle 85% of a printer or a computer, you get more money for that activity than if you only recover 70%. And that's a market incentive that I was speaking about before that I think works. Set the targets and the market will respond to getting to those targets efficiently.
Thank you. So the follow-on to that is actually for all four of you in the recycling, in use of electric cars, in using Coke and returning your bottles, and also for travel. Is there any discussion on making some kind of consumer credits so that it's an incentive for me as a consumer, that I know that if I participate in that kind of program and I want to go and buy another computer, or I want to take a car or buy a car or purchase something, that I'm going to get some kind of credit on even if I have to mail in for the coupon. It will increase the recycling rate, it will increase the participation rate, and be able to provide some resources and some kind of return. I just don't know if there's any kind of organized discussion on trying to make something like that happen.
The aviation industry right now is going through some fairly staggering changes, and it all has to do with the fact that the pricing is all happening online. And so the rate or the race to the bottom in terms of the price for the ticket is starting to defeat opportunities to try to have something along those lines. It's interesting that Aeroplan is a remarkable company for their sustainability practices, both as a company with what they do sort of within the company, but also what they've been trying to do with respect to offset credits and the like. The problem is that with that staggering price comparison that happens with online purchases, it's really defeating any kind of opportunity to provide that sense of credits or offsets or any of that stuff. None of those schemes have worked. There are some interesting sustainable travel companies that, especially when you're talking about package tours in around the Caribbean and sun destinations, because really what some of those companies are engaging in those countries is horrific. but it's got an awfully long way to go. And I'm not sure that doing it at the price point of the consumer is going to be able to do it simply because of the price comparison.
So one hand in the middle here. So there we go.
So just a question to Toby. When you look at your 30-year plan, or what's going to happen, I look at my recent ticket to Heathrow, which is about 60% tax. And when I look at that, I kind of wonder what value I'm getting for those taxes. But I wonder how that plays into your 30-year vision, because do you see that 60% going to 80% or 90% of the ticket?
I think about it in a slightly different way. When airports are privatized in Canada, something happened that, which is what you do see on your ticket. And that is that aviation infrastructure right across the country was finally brought up to a level where we could handle existing demand, but also plan for additional capacity. What is interesting in the United States is that the reverse is happening. In the United States, all airports are run by municipalities and they receive federal funding. And those subsidies are going to be running out. And they're desperately trying to figure out, so, for example, New York is looking for a fourth airport. The existing ones they've got are full. Chicago's Midway Airport has got a redevelopment program that's going to cost them almost $9 billion, and they don't have the money to do it. LAX redevelopment program is about that size. What's happening is that the infrastructure is starting to collapse in the United States, and so therefore Canadian airports are in this position where competitively, because air carriers are looking for very efficient operations, they're starting to pick Canadian airports to fly in and out of, and they want to then do short connections into the United States. I don't know what the fiscal situation is. I know that the federal government is not going to hand back to consumers the money they collect from aviation, right? It's not going to happen over the next little while. But it does put us in an interesting competitive position vis-a-vis other jurisdictions where they can't spend on infrastructure. So I think you're going to see a bit of a change, and the Americans aren't going to be able to continue going the way they are. They're going to have to find sources of revenue that they don't do right now. So I think it's going to be a very interesting competitive landscape in the next little while.
This question for Brad. Does the use of the plant-based resin have any impact on the PET recycling stream?
No, it's completely recyclable, so it doesn't contaminate the recycling stream at all. Yeah.
One or two more, and then we're up there.
This is a question for Ian. I'm curious, what is the cost to fill up the tank? And if your projections are underestimate the enthusiasm of the public and lots of people buying, what's the effect on the grid?
Well, the cost to fill it up in Ontario overnight would be about $1.30. It's a 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Overnight rate's a 24 kilowatt hour battery, so do the math. It's somewhere around $1.30, $1.40. And that's the same in Quebec. It's 5 cents a kilowatt hour, so it's a little cheaper. And I think in BC it's 5 cents a kilowatt hour, so it's about the same. Ontario is the only one that has really time of use rates. So in the daytime, it would cost you about $2.50 if you were to plug it in and use electricity in the main part of the day. So it's very inexpensive. I mean, that will get you roughly 160 kilometers. So you're talking about a penny a kilometer, maybe 2 cents a kilometer at the most, so it's very inexpensive to drive. In terms of the effect on the grid, there's lots of electricity. So when you look at generating capacity, there's lots of electricity available. There's actually generating capacity that has not been developed, both wind power and so forth that could be developed if need be, but there's lots of power in the grid. Where the impact could come, and this is, we get this from the utilities, is a local area. If discover interesting things when you get into electricity. Turns out that, utilities, being like most companies, they figure out how they can do things at least cost and so forth. And the transformers that supply the homes may not be capable of handling if an electric vehicle, if every household had one in that particular area, because some of those transformers were put in 15, 20, 30 years ago. They weren't thinking of the load that they've got. So there may be some issues at a very, very local level. But our point to the utilities is, well, you handled the installation of air conditioning. When I bought my first house, air conditioning was very uncommon. Now it is extremely common. I mean, you wouldn't buy a house without it now. So you've handled that. This is no different than that. So we don't really see an issue. Certainly from a generating point of view, there's lots of electricity. And even on the local level, there may be some pockets where you've got a transformer that's at the end of its life and so forth, but it should be very, very minimal.
My question goes to Brad. So you mentioned that in the production of your bottles, you can reduce the oil that you use by 30%.
That's right.
But not more, because the bottle then doesn't get clear anymore.
In that particular.
My question is it really so important to the customer that he has a clear cola bottle, or what are you afraid of? Like, are you afraid that you can't really communicate that to the customer?
It's a great question. With that particular brand, I guess it is essential that people look at the clear bottle, and the cloudy bottle doesn't sell so well, and that's what our marketing research has told us. As I mentioned, with a different brand, the Odwalla smoothie juice, just because it caters to a different consumer and sells a different product, that for whatever reason consumers are happy to buy it in that bottle. Now, that's the state of where that technology is today. That's not to say that, in a few years down the road, we're not able to, improve upon that and increase the use of that plant resin as part of the bottle. But certainly we're working on it. And, if we can make a better bottle that doesn't use petroleum, we'd certainly be interested in doing that.
We'll take one more, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
I have a question there.
Oh, there you go.
I wanted to ask Brad, just with regards to the plastics and the 30% plant, how much did you work with your end markets or the plastic recyclers to see what they could accept? Can they process a 30% plant bottle alongside a 100% petroleum bottle?
Absolutely, yeah. We just had that question before, and the plant bottle doesn't do anything, doesn't contaminate the stream, and it's 100%, still 100% recyclable. Sometimes you do get with other products, other packages that have that organic packaging, that does occur, what you just mentioned, what the other gentleman mentioned. But with this particular plant bottle, we wanted to be ensure that it was still 100% recyclable, although 30% of the actual plastic came from plant rather than coming from petroleum. But it's 100% recyclable and doesn't contaminate the stream at all whatsoever. So it can be turned into a fleece jacket. It can be turned into a carpet. It can be turned into T-shirts, just like other PET bottles are currently being used for.
So I think we're going to wrap it up. I still see hands out there, but I invite you to come and collar or maybe buy a drink for our panelists, and then you get to ask them a question. And thanks very much to the panelists for coming out in the evening to speak to all of us. It would be impossible to distill all of this into a couple points, but there were three themes that kind of leapt out at me as I was listening to everybody. The first was mindsets, and that's something that in our industry we hear a lot of. And it's interesting that it also occurs in these other industries. Toby in particular was talking about changing mindsets within the company in order to be able to look at how do you plan 30 years out without changing the way that people think. The second was the importance of the dialogue with consumers. And we heard that in respect to the EV, we heard it with respect to the computer waste, and also the consumer tastes and choices in terms of beverages. So clearly understanding how not just internal mindsets, but how's the consumer going to react going down the road to different choices and market conditions. And then the last, which I thought was interesting, was scenario planning. The importance of thinking through how the world is going to evolve. And it occurred to me that, and there may be a lot more of this going on than I know of, but that we're all to some extent doing this in isolation. So my guess is that Toby is probably not talking to Coke about how they're going to be moving around syrup, or how computers are going to be getting moved around, and whether there's a lot of us do scenario planning internally, but whether there are
intercorporate or inter-industry planning that might make sense, because to some extent all of our planning hinges upon how, our electricity planning hinges on how the car is used, and the car use depends upon how other forms of transportation are used. So whether that's there's an idea for PPG, whether there's some cross-sectoral long-term planning we could think of. Anyway, thanks so much for coming out, and feel free to